Good evening. If you're just joining us right now, you're watching News Report, and my name is Salifyanji Bweupe. If you're watching us right now, you're catching us on your Top Stars channel 112, as well as our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, which is live TV as well. We urge you to come through on 0976 599 547. So right now, I'm about to introduce our guest, and this is Dr. Olins Mfune from the Higher Education Authority. Dr. Olins, welcome to News Report.
Thank you, Salifyanji, and good evening viewers.
Right, and I should mention that Dr. Olins is the Manager for Standards, Research and Institutional Audits. I hope I got that right.
Yes, you got it right.
Okay, so now to kickstart this particular interview, we're talking about mushrooming numbers of institutions of higher education and the implications. So what is the Higher Education Authority?
Yeah, thank you, Salifyanji. The Higher Education Authority is a regulatory body that regulates the higher education sector in Zambia.
Right.
It was formed through the Act of Parliament, the Higher Education Act number 4 of 2013. That is what established the Higher Education Authority. Maybe later I'll go into the details of what the authority does, but basically it is a regulatory body for the higher education sector, and it coordinates the higher education sector, particularly in relation to university education, and it acts as a quality assurance agency, external quality assurance agency for the sector. Okay,
so from what you have said, should we gather that it is mandatory for every institution to be registered under the Higher Education Authority?
Yeah, maybe just to explain the way our sector is. There are other players in the higher education sector.
Right.
For example, in the TVET sector, you have TVETA, and you have teachers training colleges that offer up to diploma level that are regulated by the Teaching Council of Zambia. Now, for us, largely we focus on universities and those colleges that are outside TVETA and also the Teaching Council of Zambia. And when you look at the university education sector, this sub-sector, you will actually find that we have two types or two categories of universities and institutions. You have public universities such as the University of Zambia, Copperbelt University and others.
Right.
And then you also have private universities. So when it comes to registration, it is our role to register private universities. For public universities, they are established through a statutory instrument by the Minister of Higher Education, though they do come under us when it comes to quality assurance.
Okay, so because I was also going to ask you the distinction between TCZ, Teachers Council of Zambia, and also the Higher Education Authority. But of course, you have mentioned that you deal with institutions that are not falling under TVETA. Right.
Yes.
Okay. So I wanted to find out how many higher institutions are currently registered with HEA?
Yes. For us, we have 55 universities or higher education institutions that are registered with us, and we have oversight over 9 public universities. Yes.
Okay. So what now? This brings me to my next question. I wanted to find out what is the procedure for registration.
Okay.
To register under HEA.
In order for a private university to be registered, or any other form of higher education institution that may fall under us, first and foremost, that institution has to register as a company with BACRA.
Okay.
So once it's registered and it's a body corporate, then it applies to the Higher Education Authority for registration. Now, in order for that institution to be registered with the Higher Education Authority, it has to fulfill certain requirements. In other words, it has to meet the standards that the Higher Education Authority has set. As an external quality assurance body for the higher education sector, we set standards for various aspects of a higher education institution. So that institution has to meet those particular standards. They lodge in an application to the Higher Education Authority, and when they lodge in, there are certain issues or certain elements that we want them to fulfill. They have, first and foremost, they need to have the necessary infrastructure, suitable infrastructure in place. They must also have already identified, core teaching staff that will provide teaching and learning in that institution. They must also have adequate financial resources to ensure that that institution will run smoothly without any disturbances for a period of time. In addition to that, they have to develop a number of policies relating to how that institution will operate. And currently also, we always require that when an institution is applying for registration, they should also develop at least 3 learning programs. These are programs of study that students can actually pursue in that. So in order for that institution to be registered, then it must ensure that it meets all this, and it must have credible learning programs that must be accredited by the authority before that institution can be given a certificate of registration, or what others call a license, if you like.
So would you be able to give like a time frame in which, if an institution has all the requirements, how long does it take to actually get an institution registered or licensed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if an institution has all the requirements, meets all the requirements, if there was such an institution that is so organized that they have all their policies together, they have organized their teaching staff, they have quality learning programs that can pass accreditation, then we should be able to do that within 30 days. That's what the law provides for.
So you get people from the higher education authority to go and inspect the institutional infrastructure that wishes to, of the institution, right? That needs to be registered or licensed.
Yes. We follow a 3-stage process in the registration of a higher education institution.
Right.
Once an institution has applied and they have submitted their documentation to the authority, first and foremost, there's a desk review.
Okay.
We review the application to make sure that they have the policies that will govern the running of that institution, and that certain aspects are met. Similarly, the learning programs that I mentioned are also reviewed at that stage. And if we think, depending on what we have seen in that application, that there is merit for this institution to be inspected, then we go to the next stage. The next stage is a physical inspection, where we now say, okay, this institution has put in place these policies, and there's reason to believe that it can be a success. And in that regard, we now go to the second stage, which is a site visit. A site visit requires that we visit the institution at their registered premises and conduct a verification exercise and inspection of the infrastructure to make sure that that meets the requirements of higher education authority. Now, when we go for this site inspection, there are 2 types of inspection. We have a team that will look at all the policies, will look at the institution from a very broad perspective. They will look at a number of aspects in terms of policies, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of financial resources, in terms of health and sanitation facilities, in terms of safety, in terms of whether that institution has financial policies or risk mitigation policies. All those areas we look at. Then there's another team that will specifically focus on the learning programs. Now, when we are focusing on the learning programs, as you know, we are an external quality assurance agency, and our expertise is basically in quality assurance. We are not typically subject experts for each and every learning program. So for these learning programs, we use experts which are drawn from universities. These experts are people who are already in the education sector, and they are selected on the basis of the expertise and experience. They have a PhD, let's say, in economics, and they have been teaching, and they are very knowledgeable about that course content and so on. And so we use these people to assess those learning programs.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's the second stage.
Sure.
Now, should an institution pass this second stage, we are satisfied that they have put in place these mechanisms and we have verified, then that institution goes to the third stage. This third stage is the panel hearing stage. At the panel hearing stage, the institution presents their proposal. This is a project proposal in a way.
Right.
That this is what we propose to do.
Okay.
And this is how we're going to achieve it. This is what we have put in place. And should there be anything that we notice during the desk review or even during the site visit, then we'll raise those issues and allow the institution to defend that particular project, and if there are any misunderstandings, we clarify them. So this is the process. After that, that panel hearing will recommend to management, who then recommends to the board whether that particular institution should be registered or not.
Right.
So that's the process that we follow.
I have a very just simple question.
Yes.
Does the proprietor need to be a qualified educator as well to open up an institution?
Well, not necessarily, but the team that the proprietor puts up to govern and manage the institution need to be appropriately qualified. So when we start assessing, we'll look at the management team first and foremost. We'll look at the vice chancellor. We have standards for who qualifies to be a vice chancellor, who qualifies to be a deputy vice chancellor, who qualifies to be a registrar, to be a bursar, to be a librarian, and the deans of schools. You know, so we have that criteria, and we'll assess according to that criteria.
Okay, so now TCZ denied accreditation for about 16 colleges of education for failure to meet standard requirements. What is your role in this as well, and what is it that what are the consequences or the repercussions of failing to meet the standards that are required to have an institution running?
Okay, so I may not really speak on what TCZ does. I may not be very competent to comment on the processes that the Teaching Council of Zambia uses. However, my understanding is, basically there tend to be two processes. One is that where an institution applies for, in our case, is registration of that particular institution and accreditation of the learning program. If it doesn't meet the standards that have been set by the accreditation body or registration body, and for us, that's Higher Education Authority, and in terms of colleges of education that go up to diploma level, we are talking about TCZ. Then it actually means that they cannot be given a registration certificate. The implications are basically the fact that that institution will not be registered and recognized as a higher education institution in Zambia. Now, what this process attempts to do is to control for who enters the sector and who doesn't enter the sector. In other words, we are looking for credible institutions, institutions that have the capacity, institutions that have the experience, and institutions that will be able to deliver quality education to the Zambian people. So at the registration process, those who we believe do not have the capacity to meet our standards and deliver quality education, they are unable to enter the sector until they have put in place mechanisms. That's one process. The second process is a situation where institutions have been in operation. Maybe at one point they were registered and accredited, and then perhaps due to certain factors that they may not have enough resources or well-qualified teaching staff, they after being monitored and evaluated, in our case we call it institutional audits, we find that there are certain flaws in their system, and we realize that if they stay in the system, then it may affect the quality of product that we get from the sector. In that case, an institution can be deregistered in our case.
Right.
For other appropriate authorities, maybe what they do is withdraw the learning program or withdraw the accreditation. Okay, so but for us, we deregister that particular higher education institution.
Right. And how often rather are the institutional audits done?
In the case of higher education authority, our standard is that we audit an institution every year. Each and every registered institution needs to be audited
every year, not every financial year end, according to when the institution was registered.
So, for example, if an institution is registered in January, we may give it a year or so to operate, and after that, we come and audit that particular institution to make sure that what they plan to do is what they're doing, and they're maintaining quality, and they're delivering on what they promised to deliver to the Zambian people.
Sure. So if you're watching us right now, you are watching News Report, and I'm joined by Dr. Olins Mfune, and I'm told we have a message from the viewer. This one says, what about these institutions that offer short courses online and certificates for a once-off amount? Are they considered legitimate?
Okay. Of course, we haven't had the definition of what a short course is. So, for us as a higher education authority, when it comes to accreditation of learning programs, we start from degrees. Of course, we do accredit also, diplomas, and so on and so forth. But if you see what qualifies to be a qualification in Zambia, normally we start with a certificate. And when it's a certificate, then we have to follow the Zambia Qualifications Authority standards. They have defined in terms of length and in terms of credit what a certificate is. So maybe 6 months or more, you may start talking about a formal certificate. But some short courses do not actually lead to a qualification. There are short courses that are certificates of attendance, certificates of achievements, certificates of completion. Some of those are continuous professional development courses. They are offered for 2 months, they are offered for 3 months. That is not really our mandate really to regulate those. What we are looking at are courses that lead to a formal qualification within the higher education sector. Now, when you look at what we do, largely as an authority, our main focus has really been on degrees, bachelor's degrees, all the way to PhD. But as I mentioned, when you look at colleges, there may be those colleges that are outside the teaching council and outside TVETA, and also those we do register. So you find that those programs, those colleges perhaps offering a diploma and a certificate. And occasionally you have universities also that offer those qualifications, and that really becomes our mandate to regulate and accredit those programs.
Okay, so you held a consultative meeting with some stakeholders, and amongst these was the Ministry of Justice as well, to discuss the amendment of the Higher Education Bill. Are you willing to share how that went?
Well, again, I think this is a process that is being led by Ministry of Justice in collaboration with the Ministry of Higher Education. But of course, we are a very key stakeholders. I may not comment on the nitty-gritty of these amendments, but I think what we are trying to do is we have seen that there are a number of gaps in the Higher Education Act, and that it is critical to address those gaps. Some of those gaps is not really a secret. For example, a secret that when you look at the higher education sector, there are overlapping mandates, and sometimes that creates confusion over who does what in the sector. So the consultative process is just to make sure that we have consensus over a number of issues and find a smooth way of working within this regulatory space. But you know, the Higher Education Act also has certain issues that have not been have been quite problematic for us. For example, it doesn't provide for university colleges. So there's an attempt to provide for university colleges. It doesn't provide for other institutions to be affiliated, let's say, to private universities. So the Act tries to provide for that, for that. So there are quite a number of issues in there that are pertinent to the smooth operation of the higher education sector, and these consensus or stakeholder meetings are intended to ensure that we strengthen the Higher Education Act, provide for issues where we see that there are gaps, and also make sure that we find a way of working together. You know, when you talk about the higher education sector, you also find that professional bodies have a role to play. Professional bodies such as maybe the General Nursing Council, the Health Professionals Council of Zambia, and so on. They have a stake in the sector. And so we have found ourselves in this space. How do we work together, you know, in order to make sure that our people get good quality education? So that's the consultative process that is been going on.
Okay. With the need for for employment and the lack of employment, I think from a lot of students and young people, that yes, they'll go through college, they'll go through universities, and there's no, you know, job for them. Does the Higher Education Authority look beyond the education and just help students find suitable employment? Okay,
that's a very good question. Of course, it's not really our mandate to provide jobs. As I mentioned, we're an external quality assurance agency. So what we do, however, as an agency, is to make sure that the type of learning that goes on is competence-based kind of learning. That students get out of our education system certain skills and competences that will enable them you know, be employable, and not just employable, but will also enable them to create employment. So in the past, we didn't have these processes like the accreditation process that I mentioned. You have to look at our education sector in a very historic context. We started off as a country first with one university. Then we moved on to have the Copper Belt University. It was only in the early 1990s, when the higher education sector was liberalized, that the private actors began also to provide education. Now, if you look at the early 1990s, it is only in 2015 that the Higher Education Authority began to operate. The Higher Education Authority was set up through the 2013 Higher Education Act, as I mentioned. So when you look from the 1990s to 2015, you find we lost over a decade. Okay, that means that now higher education institutions were offering learning programs according to their own statutes as a higher education institution. But with this accreditation process, when it comes to accreditation, what we do is to evaluate that particular learning program. And when we evaluate, we look at the learning outcomes. We look at what kind of skills, you know, is the student going to acquire from these particular programs. We look at the relevance of that program. Is it really relevant to the labor market or the industry to which well it is in that particular student? So you see that for us to ensure that these students are employable, to ensure that these students have ability to create jobs, we use this accreditation process to make sure that that program is relevant. Now, this is a process which has just started. We started the accreditation process somewhere around 2017. So we are still in that particular process. And what we hope is that as the nation gets to grip with this accreditation process, we'll see quality graduates that are channeled out there. But also, maybe the other thing that I may mention, and then it means we're going to come back to the Higher Education Act amendments that we're talking about. We saw that you can see two paths in our education sector today. You can see the academic path. You can also see the vocation, skills, and technical path. And for quite a long time, university education has emphasized more the academic pathway rather than the technical skills and vocational pathway. So if you look at let's say a college like maybe a technical college like Nortec, that is producing people that maybe will be technicians that have hands-on kind of learning and following a vocational path. When it came to following university education, there was no pathway for them. So they'll end up at CBU, they'll end up at the University of Zambia maybe to take a degree, and then they follow perhaps an academic pathway. And to try and correct that, that there's been a proposal to amend that act to provide for technical universities and to provide for technical university colleges. And also when you look at the higher education policy of 2019, it tries to emphasize that. So sometimes we have to understand that perhaps the process of policy development has been a little bit slow when it comes to the higher education sector. Because previously we have had a lot of emphasis on primary and basic education. So we only got to get a policy that is specific to the higher education sector in 2019. And we are now in that implementation process.
Okay. I'm told we have another text message. This one said, you recently released a list of illegally operating institutions. Is there an update on whether they have stopped operating?
Oh, thank you very much. Indeed, in fact, we do this periodically. We have an inspectorate. When we go round, we conduct inspections, and if we find an institution that is operating without registration, then we sanction that particular institution. And I have to report that some of the institutions, indeed, they have stopped operating, and some of them have written to us. Some of the institutions have actually applied for registration so that they can legitimize their stay in the sector. But otherwise, what we have done is not to allow an institution that is illegal to operate. And that's why it's important always to have a regulatory body in a sector like ours. Okay,
so when it comes to challenges with the mandate that the Higher Education Authority, and also maybe how do you deal with the projection of probably those institutions that may compromise the requirements of quality education?
Okay, thank you. Now, as I mentioned, there are a number of quality assurance processes. So at entry, as I mentioned, we have this registration process where these institutions have to meet certain standards before they can enter the sector. But we don't stop there. Once they're in the sector, we continue. As they add on more learning programs, we continue with the accreditation of learning programs. But we also continue with what we call institutional audits. Means that we periodically monitor their systems, their quality assurance systems, their processes, that they're in place, their operations, to ensure that they continue to meet those standards, and not only to meet those standards, but to go above the standards. Now, where we find that institutions are not meeting the standards, normally what we do through our quality assurance, through the institutional audits, is we'll write to them and tell them that we have found that you are deficient in A, B, C, D. Now, to correct the situation, give us an improvement plan. Take action on A, B, C, D. So the institutions will develop an action plan, an improvement plan, which we ourselves will approve and monitor. Now, should these institutions continue not to meet our standards, and when we look at our act and find that the standards have deteriorated to the extent that the Higher Education Act demands that we deregister that particular institution, we do go ahead and deregister that particular institution. I think you have heard in the news that Higher Education Authority have deregistered this university and this university. Since 2018, for example, we have deregistered about 10, 11 higher education institutions. They are no longer operating in the sector.
Okay, so how would a student or a guardian identify which institution is actually registered and is licensed under the Higher Education Authority?
Thank you. Now, first and foremost, for an institution to identify which institution is legitimate and is registered with the authority, they have to consult with the Higher Education Authority.
Okay.
We are accessible. First of all, physically, we are based at Mukua Pension House, just there opposite Intercity. Intercity is well known.
Okay.
There's Mukua Pension House. The parents can actually consult us. But we also have a website. If they go to the Higher Education Authority website, they'll find that we have a list of registered higher education institutions.
Right.
Not only do we have a list of registered higher education institutions, we also have a list of accredited learning programs. The other way is that, every year, and we are obligated by law that every year we gazette the registered higher education institutions and publish them in a daily paper. So each year by 31st March, there's a list of registered institutions that are published so that the public can be aware that this institution is actually registered. In addition, I just have to mention that we have just released the first State of Higher Education report. And in that State of Higher Education report, which we are hoping shall be material that most parents and also learners that intend to enter the higher education sector should be able to read through and consult. And at the back, there's appendices. We have a list of registered universities and recognized universities. The ones we recognize, these are public universities. So we have private and public universities. And we also have a list of accredited learning program for each and every university.
Okay, I do believe we have another message. Doc, you have mentioned a number of players in the higher education sector. How do you ensure that you don't overlap in the execution of functions that seem similar?
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, as I mentioned, there are quite a number of players.
Right.
But most of these players are statutory bodies like ourselves, meaning that they are actually government bodies.
Right.
And I think that maybe it's just that this process, this journey that we've embarked in, where you have an external quality assurance agency like Higher Education Authority, is quite new. And previously, before we were on in this sector, there were professional bodies that were playing a role of overseeing certain training programs pertaining to their professions, because they have a stake, they have an interest in them. And so when we entered the sector, of course, it was like maybe a teething stage. I know most people are aware about what happened over CBU, but we are finding means of working together, because we all have the same goal at the end of it all. It is to make sure that we have quality human resource for the country in the various professions and sectors. So already we have memorandums of understandings with various professional bodies, so that we do this work together. As I'm talking right now, some of our officers are with the Health Professionals Council of Zambia on a similar trip to undertake similar type of work. So we are now busy trying to find means and mechanisms of working together, and we are implementing that. And that consultative process that you referred to in the context of the Higher Education Act is another way of trying to find ways of working together within this regulatory space.
Right. In conclusion, and in line with quality assurance as well, we know that for a period of time schools and institutions were closed. How did that affect you as the Higher Education Authority, and what is it that you did to ensure that the modalities that were earlier stated by the President or the Minister of Health were actually followed by the institutions?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this has been a challenging time globally, And I think that the higher education sector, just like other sectors,
Right.
was grossly affected by the COVID pandemic to some extent.
Right.
We're still affected.
Yes.
And most learners had to go away from school. Now, given that situation, and it was new for all of us,
Exactly.
and the learning curve was quite steep, and we all had to find means and ways of delivering education within this kind of challenge. And I think what had happened, however, is that I think developments in ICT were quite helpful. As you know, one of the sectors that is growing rapidly is that sector of electronic learning, e-learning. And so most of the universities were able to put in place resources, electronic resources, to continue with delivering teaching and learning. So even when we had this COVID situation affecting us, most of the institutions went towards e-learning. And what we are still doing now is grappling with how best e-learning can actually be delivered. What sort of technological systems should be in place? What sort of resources should actually be in place? What kind of teaching approaches should be in place? What kind of assessments should be done? As you know, there are also issues to do with
and maybe these learning processes should be inculcated, you know, in every student.
And also just to have people maybe fix it in their mind that we are in this situation and we have no choice but to go this way. And as I'm talking now, some of the institutions have taken on blended learning, and of course some institutions, some of their students have come back. But in terms of ensuring that health guidelines are adhered to, these institutions, when you go, even now, you'll find that at the gate, you'll find people with thermometers and sanitizers. So they are also adhering to the standards that were set by the Ministry of Health. And social distancing. Some of the higher education institutions, as I'm talking, they have only partially allowed some of their students to be on campus. They have evaluated and seen those courses where it is imperative that the students are there, maybe because these are practical-based courses. And some of the courses which they can deliver online, they continue to deliver online. So but it's still a learning curve, and we're still trying to find win-win approaches within this situation in which we are in.
Okay, Doctor, before we let you go, do you have any last words that you would like to share with the viewers?
Yeah, thank you very much. First, the topic here referred to mushrooming numbers of institutions. But I have to assure the viewers, because sometimes we take this as negative. But in fact, when you look at our country, you only find that really those who manage to go through from grade 12 and going to university, in terms of progression, the rates are very low. They are still below 20%, meaning that the majority of people that pass through grade 12 really never make it to university. And when people talk about mushrooming, I know they're talking about private universities. This is a phenomenon that will be with us. The private universities should not be seen as a negative element. They are there to provide an important service and fill in a very important gap. What we are saying is government alone cannot actually manage, and private universities are providing a service meeting the demand that is there. In fact, what this has done in terms of the increase, let me say the increase in the number of universities, is that it has increased the diversity of learning programs available to learners, and it has also increased the number of places that students can enroll into and get an education. But perhaps I think the main concern that our stakeholders should have is how do we safeguard the quality of education from these universities? And it is these processes that I have mentioned, this process that we have in terms of accreditation, in terms of auditing, and have to mention also we have started what we call classification. This classification means that we are putting the universities into categories depending on capacity. So if an institution is very experienced, has got well-qualified researchers, then we are putting them in a category where we are calling them a ZQF10 institution, where they can offer PhD qualifications and other research degrees. And if we think that the institution is still young, it still has to develop certain systems, but it is still a very good institution, except that the capacity only allows it to offer up to degree level, and then we put that institution in that particular category. So every learner will know that if I am looking to get a bachelor's degree, I can go to any ZQF 7 institution that offers a bachelor's and get a bachelor's degree. If I need a PhD, then I need to go to the ZQF 10 institution and get a PhD. And then what the public needs to do is to support higher education authority as we offer these external quality assurances. And they need to also begin to learn what we do as the authority, to understand what accreditation is, to understand what registration is. Because you see that we have a number of stages here. One, it is not enough just to say the institution is registered. When you are enrolling as a learner, and this is to our audience, when you are enrolling as a learner, or when you are a parent, you look at the institution and say, okay, are they registered? Okay, they are registered, number one. Okay, what program does my child want to take? Is it economics, or is it business administration or law? Then you have to ask, is this program accredited by the authority? So you see there's that institutional accreditation or registration. Then there's programmatic accreditation, where we just accredit a specific learning program or program of study. So we need that kind of awareness, and we need the public to take a keen interest and support what we're doing as an authority. If with the support, we'll achieve what this country deserves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ollins Mfune. If you're just joining us right now, we're having a very interesting interview, and we're talking about mushrooming a number of institutions of higher education and their implications. And so we would like to thank you so much for having honored us with your presence on tonight's episode of News Report. And we hope that we'll have you, again sometime.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go on a thank you. We'll go on a break and we'll come back after this. Stay tuned.